Hello, Brain Damaged Philosopher here, and in this video I'm going to be continuing the trajectory that I began in my last video by responding to apologetics for specific Christian theology instead of responding to apologetics for the reasonableness of religion or Christianity. So in this video, I'm going to be continuing on the subject of the afterlife by talking about a sort of a strange problem that I found in Christian theology with regards to the existence of heaven and hell. And that is summed up in this simple statement. How is it possible that Christians who have non-believers as friends and deeply care about them, or even family members, can be happy in heaven while knowing that those people that they care about are burning for all eternity in hell? Because here's the thing. If you agree that it is an important component of who someone is to remember and care about the people that you cared about and who cared about you in your material life, how can that possibly go away when you transition to the afterlife without destroying who you are, right? If an important component of your person, your identity, your mind, your soul, whatever it is to care about, for instance, your best friend, right? And it happens that that best friend is a non-believer. How can you be happy in heaven knowing that they're suffering without having that core part of you that cares about them excised? And so what this means is that, essentially, if you are a Christian that has non-believing family members or friends that you deeply care about, it is impossible for you to go to heaven, because no sadness is allowed in heaven. And so if an important component of who you are would make you sad, even in heaven, because you know that someone that you care about is burning in hell, then of course that core part of you can't come with you to heaven. So now we have a problem, right? Because basically now you don't get to go to heaven. A lobotomized copy of you gets to go to heaven. And so either nobody goes to heaven because it's just lobotomized copies and it's not really the same person. Just as if someone got a brain injury and suddenly they didn't give a flying fuck about their family members or friends and cared about other things instead, you'd think that they had become a different person. So in the same way, if you have to become a different person to enter heaven, then it's not you that's entering heaven. And so either nobody can enter heaven or nobody goes to hell, because if nobody goes to hell, then obviously this isn't a problem. And obviously a Christian could respond saying that this isn't a logical problem that's a necessary result of the concept of heaven and hell. This is not an a priori definitional problem. This is only a problem because Christians have friends outside the faith, and that in the Bible it says that you're supposed to not interact with people not of the faith in the manner that you do with friends or family, or not make friends among people who are not of the faith. But first of all, the problem with this is that if you're going to try to limit Christians to only ever interacting and forming bonds with people who are also Christians, that's basically a cult now. Because it's controlling who you can interact with and who you can form a bond with, and keeping that to the in-group. And worse, this doesn't really solve the problem. Because most neurotypical people don't just have empathy and compassion for people whom they personally know. Instead, they also have empathy and compassion in general for other people that they know about, right? Or that they can even conceive of. This is why people get upset by the idea of people being murdered across the world or starving to death across the world. And so if people can become emotionally, empathetically saddened by children starving in Africa, for instance, or terrorist bombings in the Middle East, how much more so could they become saddened and upset by a gigantic amount of people suffering maximally for an infinite amount of time while they're in heaven, even if they didn't know any of those people personally. And so, even if Christians became a complete cult and never interacted or formed bond with anyone outside of their own religion, that doesn't solve the problem, because although the core part of who you are that cares about your friends and family wouldn't have to be excised for you to go to heaven, the part of you that makes you empathetic and compassionate and concerned about fairness and justice and principle would have to be excised. And so basically then, only psychopaths can go to heaven. And again, is someone who's, if you knew someone who you loved, right, and who you knew very well, if someone like that had a brain injury and suddenly all of their compassion, their sense of justice, all of their empathy, all of their sense of fairness and principle had been completely stripped away from them, and they became a complete sociopath or psychopath, would you feel like they were the same person? Probably not. And so again, either nobody really goes to heaven, because you have to become a different person to go to heaven. So nobody who is currently alive or who has ever been alive would actually get to heaven. Only a psychopathic copy. Then, so either that's the case, or again, nobody goes to hell to eliminate this problem. And part of the reason that this is a problem is because the criteria for entering heaven is so arbitrary. You have to somehow convince yourself of something that there is no good evidence for. And then, once you've convinced yourself that Jesus, everything the Bible says Jesus said, Jesus actually said, and that Jesus actually resurrected, and that Jesus was actually the Son of God and saying the truth, because because he resurrected doesn't mean every word he said was true. Once you've convinced yourself of all of that, then you also have to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Which is, again, just an arbitrary decision, because God requires a blood sacrifice to forgive things for some reason, and he just can't find it in his heart to forgive us. And, he has to forgive us in the first place because he set an arbitrarily impossible standard that he knew was impossible for us to live up to. And so, that's why it's possible for people that we care about to end up in hell. If we ended up in hell based instead on, actual, being good or actually being good or evil, instead of just doing things that God doesn't like, then nobody would care about whoever ended up in hell, because it would just be, Hitler and Stalin and Mao, instead of Stephen Hawking and Bill Gates and your therapist and your best friend, right? But even then, even if that were the case, even if we throw out the core message of the New Testament and just say that God sorts people the way Plato says that the gods sort people between Hades, Tartarus, and Elysium, on the basis of whether they were a just and good person, that's still a problem, because there would be people like me who think that it is inherently unjust to punish finite crimes, no matter how large, with an infinite punishment. Because a finite crime against an infinite God does not suddenly make the crime infinitely punishable. Because when, the more powerful a person gets, the less the crime actually matters to them, and so the less it hurts them. And so if you're trying to be proportional, actually a finite crime against an infinite God should actually make the crime that much less, because you can't really hurt God. And additionally, sin isn't really hurting God anyway. It's just doing things that he doesn't like, a lot of which are completely arbitrary and don't seem to have anything to do with his nature, such as eating shellfish or having homosexual relations. So, in the end, right, that would mean that even if God is sorting people based on whether they're just, to get into heaven or to go to hell, if someone like me had principles and saw the problem with infinite punishments for finite crime, they would have to have that part of them removed so that they're not bothered while they're in heaven. Because that would be something that I would be bothered by. And I assume that, there's no sadness in heaven. You also can't have an existential crisis in heaven. And so suddenly I believe that my sense of fairness and principle is a core component of who I am, and everyone who knows me agrees. Like, I really wouldn't be who I am if I didn't have the sense of fairness that I did. I would be a completely different person, and probably a person that no one would like very much. And so, if there are any people like me, then it would be impossible. And I think that's true for most people. Most people, again, it would be impossible for most people to get into heaven if there's anyone in hell, even only the people that we all hate. And this leaves aside the fact that the way heaven's set up right now, all of the greatest scientists and philanthropists are probably going to be in hell, and some of the greatest, mass murderers, such as Hitler and some of the Catholic popes, will be in heaven, which just completely worsens the problem. And so again, no matter how you look at this, no matter how much you eliminate, there's always some level of this problem where either nobody truly goes to heaven because they have to become a completely different person to get there, or nobody truly goes to hell. And it gets worse. Because think about it this way. If humans are inherently sinners, right, because of original sin, and the reason, like, leaving aside the fact that free will is incoherent once you, even without an omniscient God, and becomes even more incoherent once you have an omniscient God, if free will is what allows you to sin, and everyone has a sin nature, and I think it's reasonable to say that the sin nature in a lot of people and their struggle against it and such is actually a core part of who they are. But sin, is impossible in heaven. Then once you get to heaven, right, you're going to have to become a different person. Now, it might not be as radically different as in the cases I talked about before, but it's still strange that suddenly, either you get, so when you go to heaven, either you lose free will, so you can't choose to sin, or you lose the inclination to sin but keep free will. But if it's possible to just happen to not have the inclination to sin while also having free will, then God could have created the entire human race like that, and we would have all met his perfect standard, and we wouldn't need the sacrifice of Jesus. Right? So again, the only reason, as I stated in my previous video, that God wouldn't do that, if heaven is feasible, if it's feasible to have free will in heaven and also never sin in heaven, because you don't have the inclination, then it's feasible to have free will and never sin on earth. And so God could have created humans that never sinned, right? The only reason that he would have not done so is because he wanted people to sin. But why would he want people to sin? Well, the reason he would want people to sin is because he would want to demonstrate his mercy by showing them what will happen to them if he doesn't save them, right? But that raises a question. If someone's trying to demonstrate their mercy by saving you from something that they made you susceptible to in the first place, and from a punishment that they created or made necessary in the first place, see my previous video for why this is necessarily true no matter what apologetic you apply, then you're demonstrating your mercy by demonstrating your sadism. It's like saying, okay, I've addicted you to heroin, but if you take another injection of heroin, I'm going to burn you alive. But here's what I'm going to do. To demonstrate my mercy, I have this magical antidote that will make you no longer addicted to heroin. So, once I give you that, obviously you're going to want to worship me or at least praise me for my mercy, right? Because I saved you from this terrible fate that you were inevitably led down because of your nature of being addicted to heroin. In the same way, God gave us original sin, set up the punishment for original sin, and then saved us from original sin. It's retarded. It's insane. It's sadistic. Now, obviously, the question that the religious person is going to bring up again is oh, well, you see, I'm, in the first, the first couple problems with this, where either no one goes to heaven or no one goes to hell, these are logical problems. These don't have a moral tint, right? But this last thing that I brought up about original sin, this has a moral tint, doesn't it? And so, of course, the religious person is going to say, well, I have no basis on which to judge God's actions, morally speaking. So, if they base their morality on God and I base my morality on something else, why should they listen or care what I say? And I have two answers to this. Number one, I actually never used moral language. I said sadistic, insane, retarded, but I didn't say evil. Because I'm not making moral judgments here. I'm just making statements. A sadist is someone who wants to cause pain, right? That's apparently the point of what God wants to do. An insane person is someone who thinks that demonstrating your sadism and then rescuing people from it is somehow merciful, because that contradicts the definition of mercy. And so, of course, it's incoherent, and incoherency is the hallmark of insanity. I'm, again, not making moral judgments. I'm just pointing out that if this is true, this is horrific. And if you don't have the evidence to believe that this is true, why would you want to believe this? The second point I'm going to make is that I actually do, in a sense, I have as good a moral ground to judge things as religious people do. And I have the high ground in the sense that the somewhat subjective and arbitrary basis on which I choose to judge moral things is not a genocidal, sadistic, insane maniac. Now, so if a religious person had an a priori convincing reason to decide that God was actually moral, if you had an argument, then I would be forced to accept the logic of the argument and change my intuitions to make it so that I viewed God as moral. But in the absence of that argument, then I might as well go with my moral intuitions. There's no reason to adopt. See, this is the thing about objective morals, right? If you have an objective, rational argument that something not morally intuitive is actually moral, then, of course, I have to accept it. But in the absence of that argument, why should I not go with my moral intuitions? Especially since I have a moral system, that seems to support using my moral intuitions. Okay, so I think that's all for today. I hope this was a little more interesting than some of the videos I've made, because I tried a little harder in this one to be more eloquent and forceful. And I hope you guys enjoy this. And to all of you Christians out there, if you end up watching this, the point of this is to jog you out of your stupor, not to say that you're evil or that you're terrible. If you were aware of this and you don't have a problem with it, then I might have a problem with you and wonder if you're a psychopath or indoctrinated. Neither of which are really your fault, but both of which make you a dangerous person that I don't want to be around or deal with. But I don't think that this is the case for most Christians. I think most Christians cherry pick, rationalize, and compartmentalize and accept the cognitive dissonance of this belief and don't realize its pure bloodthirsty barbarity. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for listening. Bye.